Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. For a number of weeks, we have been dealing with women in the Bible. We have treated stories involving Eve, Ruth, and Esther. I've decided to keep with that theme for a while. So this week we are going to feature Sarah. As we delve into Sarah's story, let's keep in mind one of the most recurrent phrases in the Bible, namely, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. That refrain is found in every section of Jesus' Bible. Once in a while, in deference to the crucial importance of women in the church, this phrase is embellished by spontaneously mentioning Sarah, Rebekah, Rachel, and Leah, the wives of these illustrious patriarchs. Even at that, though, the names of Zilpah and Bilhah are typically omitted. These two women were maids given to Leah and Rachel, respectively, as servants. Yet, due to certain circumstances, these women also bore children to Jacob. Regardless, they are seldom mentioned, even when this list is, in fact, embellished. You'll see references to them in Genesis 29, verse 24, and verse 29. Nevertheless, they were as important as the other matriarchs in the biblical story. I contend that Sarah was the most significant matriarch of all. Why do I say this? Because Abraham had children by several women, including Hagar and Keturah. Check out Genesis 16 and Genesis 25, verses 1 through 4. However, though Abraham had more than one wife and had many children besides the famed Isaac, it was Sarah, and Sarah alone, from whom Israelite descendants were descended. These days, we speak almost casually about the Abrahamic religions, meaning, of course, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Yet, in the Hebrew Bible, Jesus' Bible, the book that Christians would eventually refer to as the Old Testament, Sarah, and Sarah alone, was the crucial ancestress who would further God's election of God's people. Let me make my case. In Genesis 11, we first hear about Sarah, whose name was at that time Sarai. For convenience, I will simply refer to her as Sarah in this podcast. We learn that she was the wife of Avram, or Abraham, as he was later to be called. That's in verse 29 of chapter 11. We also learn that Sarah had no children, for she was barren, in verse 30 of chapter 11. For a while, she remains in the background and has no speaking parts in the unfolding narrative. Obviously, after God summoned Abraham and told him to leave his country and go somewhere else, Sarah accompanied her husband. That's in verses 4 through 5 of chapter 12. Most of the interactions with the deity, however, involve Abraham alone. She has an important role when Abraham went to Egypt to withstand a famine ravishing the land of Canaan. Still, she says nothing in that episode. In that little drama, Abraham is worried that Sarah's beauty will make her irresistible to the Egyptians. Pharaohs especially like beautiful women. Abraham is concerned about his own life, thinking that his wife is so desirable that the Egyptians will dispatch him to get to her. For this reason, he asks Sarah to tell anyone who asks that she is his sister, not his wife. Sure enough, when they get to Egypt, Sarah is whisked off to become part of Pharaoh's harem. The king is thrilled enough with this catch that he lavishes Abraham with gifts, sheep, oxen, male and female asses, male and female servants, and camels. But the Lord put a kibosh on this. The deity afflicted the Pharaoh with plagues because he had taken Sarah to be his own. The Pharaoh discerned the problem and asked Abraham why he had lied. The king did not even wait for an answer. Instead, he gave Sarah back to Abraham and sent them away, with all those presents to boot. In this episode, Sarah was a principal figure, yet she has not said a thing. We are not even told that she said, "I am Abraham's sister." Sarah's first speaking part comes in Genesis 16. Since she believed that God had prevented her from having children, she tells Abraham to have sex with her Egyptian maid, doubtless one of the presents that the Pharaoh had previously given the couple. That's in verses 1 through 2 of chapter 16. Abraham, of course, did not protest. The plan actually worked, in that Abraham had sex with Hagar, the Egyptian maid, who consequently got pregnant. That's in verses 3 and 4. Unfortunately, when this happened, Hagar looked on Sarah contemptuously. Sarah, therefore, had something else to say. She declared that the wrong done to her should be on Abraham, in that she gave Hagar to her husband, only be to regarded with contempt when the woman was with child. That's in verse 5. Abraham complained that the maid still belonged to Sarah, who should do as she liked. Sarah took Abraham's words as a license to treat her maid harshly. That's in verse 6. The next incident underscores my contention that Sarah was more important than Abraham in the divine economy. Again, Abraham had children by different women, but this incident confirms that God wanted the elect people to derive only from Sarah. Of course, Abraham had already worried that he was getting too old to father children. In Genesis 15, Abraham complained that, were he to die immediately, a slave born in his house would become his heir. So far, Abraham had not fathered any children. God countered by saying that Abraham's own child would be his heir. That's in verses 1 through 6 of chapter 15. For the time being, at least, Abraham trusted the Lord. But he had not trusted God sufficiently. That is why he took Sarah's advice to sleep with Hagar. That had produced a son, Ishmael. That's in verse 11 of chapter 16. Ishmael may have been Abraham's son, but he was not Sarah's. That is why what took place in Genesis 17 is so stunning. In this passage, God changes Abraham's and Sarah's names. That's in verses 1 through 8 of chapter 17. And as well, reiterates the promise of progeny and land. When God told Abraham that Sarah would be the mother of his child, that seemed preposterous. After all, Abraham was almost 100 years old, and Sarah was 90. That is not an age when couples look for a house close to a school. In fact, when God mentioned this, Abraham fell on his face and laughed. That's in verse 17. This was not a stifled giggle. This was a guffaw, along with a collapse. It did not matter how many children Abraham would sire. Only the child born to Sarah would count, at least in terms of the elect people of God. Indeed, in this scene, Abraham even brought up Ishmael as a candidate as the child of promise. That's in verse 18. But God would not hear of it. Sarah would be Israel's ultimate matriarch. Sarah agreed with Abraham that they were too old to have children. That is why she laughed herself when 3 men stopped by their tent one day. That's in verses 1 to 2 in chapter 18. Being appropriately hospitable, Abraham invited these men to rest a bit, wash their feet, have a drink of water, and some refreshments. The men accepted the offer. At that point, Abraham pulled out all the spots. He ordered Sarah to prepare a meal, which she did. He also prepared the fatted calf. That's as verses 3 through 8 of chapter 18. After they ate, they asked where Sarah was. Abraham said that she was in the tent. All of a sudden, the three men morphed into the Lord, who said that in the spring Sarah would bear a son. That's in verses 9 through 10 of chapter 18. Again, given their advanced age, this seemed absurd. Sarah had overheard this divine remark, which made her laugh to herself. She thought, "After I have grown old and my husband is old, shall I have pleasure?" That's in verse 12. It turns out that the Lord heard this snicker and asked Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh?" Sarah immediately denied having laughed, but the Lord was not buying it. That's in verses 14 and 15. Of course, in Genesis 21, the Lord indeed visited Sarah, thus enabling her to become pregnant and bear a child. The name they gave is priceless, since Isaac is Hebrew for "he laughed." Of course, the laughter now was about the joyous reception of a new child, rather than a derisive dismissal of a divine promise. That's in chapter 21, verse 26. Sarah's last speaking part occurs in Genesis 21. As noted, the Lord visited Sarah, resulting in her pregnancy and the birth of Isaac. That's in the first 3 verses of chapter 21. This is part of a standard motif in which important women need divine help to become pregnant. When Isaac was weaned at an unspecified age, Abraham had a feast to celebrate. It was on that occasion that Sarah noticed Ishmael, Abraham's son, by the Egyptian maid Hagar, playing. The Greek text adds, playing with Isaac. This upset Sarah terribly, so she ordered Abraham to cast out Hagar and her son. She referred to Ishmael as Hagar's son, not as Abraham's. Sarah was somehow worried that Ishmael would become a co-heir with Isaac. Abraham was not happy about doing this, but God confirmed to him that it was only through Isaac that his descendants would come. That's in verse 12 of chapter 21. With that encouragement, God told Abraham to listen to his wife Sarah. The next day, Abraham kicked out of the family circle Hagar and Ishmael, even though he gave Hagar provisions for the journey. This is the last time we hear from Sarah. Her death was later noted in verses 1 through 2 of chapter 23. The only other reference to her is in Isaiah 51, verse 2, when Sarah is referred to as the one who bore you, referring to Israel. Even in that verse, though, the second part quotes God as blessing Abraham and making him into many peoples. That slight notwithstanding, it was Sarah's child that became the rock from which Israel was hewn. That's in verse 1 of chapter 51 of Isaiah. If there had been no Sarah, there would never have been an Israel, the elect people of God. Let me encourage you to go to my website, faspina.com. Record there for me your email. If you have a question you'd like me to answer in a future Q&A session, email me at fspina106@gmail.com. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do two simple things. One, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. Two, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.